Picture this. You are a poor parent who could not afford the growing costs of childcare, and now suddenly you are indebted to that company. Next thing you know, you're arrested for failure to pay child support and are put in jail, one reason being that you could not afford a lawyer to properly defend you. You are now experiencing the collateral consequences in the justice system. Even though Gideon versus Wainwright established the right to an attorney even if you could not afford one in 1963, this decision only applies for criminal cases and not civil ones. Criminal cases are cases that deal with offenses against the state or federal government. It can be something as literal as a person assaulting a federal officer, but an offense to the state can mean breaking any criminal law established by the government. Civil cases deal with disputes between one entity and another, where the cause of action can be initiated by private or public parties, usually dealing with monetary matters. Unfortunately, today, many states do not offer legal support to the poor in major civil disputes. Because there is already a lack of funds, poor people cannot pay for many resources they need and therefore tend to be caught up in more civil cases than criminal. For example, some of the big issues include child support payments, rent disputes, utility bills, and home foreclosures. This creates what is known as debtor's prison. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, a debtor's prison is the arrest and jailing of poor people for failure to pay legal debts they can never hope to afford through criminal justice procedures that violate their most basic rights. Many believe that prison is the solution to the poor involved in these civil cases. In reality, debtor's prison creates issues of quality public health care and a culture of violence and abuse that extends past the jail cells into their everyday life for non-criminals. There is also the issue of the justice gap created in civil cases. The justice gap is the lack of assistance for poor Americans. Specifically, unequal representation from lawyers in courts for the poor creates this inequality in legal help. If they can afford a lawyer, it could help lessen the bail amount and prove their innocence more easily, but it would be extremely expensive and detrimental in the long run with how great the expenses would be. However, most cannot afford a lawyer and therefore have two options. Option 1 is to pay the bail that is initially set by the court, but many cannot even afford bail or even a bail bondsman who requires 10 to 15% of the bail amount in the state of Virginia. Instead, they wait for their court date in jail, which could be many months. During this time, the parent cannot be with their family or make any sort of income. Which is why option 2 is more popular than one may believe. There are many who choose to plead guilty even when they have a viable chance to prove themselves innocent. These parents cannot afford to spend time in jail and would rather have something on their record, even if it was avoidable. However, organizations like the Legal Service Corporation exist to counteract the justice gap. The LSC is an independent nonprofit established by Congress in 1974 to provide financial support for civil legal aid to low-income Americans. It also funds 133 nonprofit legal organizations in every state and U.S. territory. This organization caters to households who are at or below 125% of the federal poverty guidelines. People who are eligible clients for LSC are the working poor, military families, homeowners and renters, farmers, the disabled, and the elderly. Unfortunately, the Legal Service Corporation does not reach a lot of the population that needs its services. The LSC estimated that over 60 million Americans are in need of their services, but the organization calculates that over 80% of the legal needs of the poor go unmet. Budget and funding from the government is at an all-time low. The LSC receives $375 million of the $400 million actually appropriated for the group in the mid-90s. Also, most people do not know of its existence. While the LSC travels all over the country to meet with leaders of law firms, corporations, and foundations to spread awareness and gain support, those campaigns do not reach their clientele, low-income families scattered across America. Right now, the legal system is not equal for the poor, but we have come up with some suggestions to help have a fairer and more just system. To make bail become more affordable rather than a guaranteed jail sentence, the amount could be based off percent of income rather than a standard amount for each crime. The court should take into account the accused's home life and judge then what is a reasonable bail price. Also, all lawyers could be required to volunteer in an equal amount of criminal and civil cases per year to keep their bar license. Higher quality legal help could be provided to all, not just for those who can afford it or for those guaranteed a public attorney in criminal cases. To improve the LSC, we suggest increasing the budget and spreading the word to the common people about the organization. The courts can also be required to suggest the LSC at bail for all civil cases to increase the legal help a poor person deserves but does not usually receive. Although there are some problems that are just unavoidable. The time it takes for courts to process a case from when bail is set is hard to adjust. Adding more courts would need more judges, more buildings, and resources, which seems unfeasible and would take a lot of the taxpayer dollars.
After you were arrested, police went to investigate your house. While they were investigating, they found 20 grams, which is a little less than half of a pound of cocaine. Now, you are facing charges of drug possession in the state of Virginia, and possession of cocaine constitutes as a felony. Furthermore, you were found guilty of possession with intent to distribute, probably because you were going to use the money to free up some of your debt, like the child support. The court decides that you will serve 2 years in prison. Flash forward 2 years and you are released from prison. Now, you are back in the real world, but instead of being just another normal person, you are a felon, specifically a drug felon. There are other ways to become a felon. For example, any kind of murder, sexual or physical assault, kidnapping, illegal possession of firearms or drugs, or burglary over certain amounts all constitute as kinds of felonies. However, like I said, you are a drug felon. In fact, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the percent of current inmates that were convicted for homicide, aggravated assault, kidnapping, or sexual assault in October of 2017 totals to about 12.4%. However, this is in complete contrast to the percent of current inmates that were convicted for drug charges in October of 2017, which is 46.3%. The number of criminals facing drug charges, a felony, amounts for nearly half of all current inmates. So, now what happens to you that you are a felon out of prison? Well, really 2 different things will happen. 1, you will lose many of the rights that you had as a citizen before you were a felon, and 2, you now have a negative stigma surrounding you because you are a felon. Registered felons are banned from imposing any legal fees upon conviction, applying for federal housing for up to 5 years, voting or holding political office, or receiving retirement benefits from the state of Virginia. Additionally, many business certificates will be revoked, including your painter certificate. In fact, around 34% of all non-working men ages 25 to 54 have a criminal record. So now, you are left in even more debt than you were before jail because you cannot pay your legal fees. The bank took your house when you went to jail, so now you have no home, and are banned from federal housing for at least 5 years. Your qualification to be a painter was revoked, making finding employment nearly impossible. And finally, you aren't even allowed to vote to represent yourself in these increasingly unfortunate circumstances. So what if you had not been poor? What if you came from a family that had money? Would these rights that are being taken away from you have such an impact? The answer is no, because you would have the funds to pay your legal fees and other debts. You wouldn't have to depend on federal housing for a place to stay. You wouldn't need to depend on the government for welfare programs to promote your well-being. Because felons' rights restrictions are taking away the employment credibility for easily replaceable positions, reducing overall employment chances, and diminishing accessibility to federal welfare programs, felons' right restrictions are composed to disproportionately target lower socioeconomic classes. Instead of giving felons an equal chance of reintegration as an upstanding citizen into society, like society expects, the system is set up in a way where felons and ex-criminals have to work with the odds stacked against them, especially if they were of a lower socioeconomic status to begin with. So, as we have addressed much of your situation, we never specified which racial group you belong to. Let's say you're a Black American. Perhaps you're thinking, does it make a difference? And, in fact, it does. In 2007, Michael Alexander studied prison demographics and found that nearly 1 out of 11 prison inmates were Black, a vastly disproportionate amount compared to the actual percentage of the population. Alexander also found that drug crimes constituted for the largest number of Black inmates. However, it has been proven that whites and Blacks use drugs at nearly the same rate, yet white Americans are not facing the same crackdown as Black Americans are. So, because you are Black, you are even more negatively affected by the justice system. And because you are a poor Black American, your chances of a successful reintegration into society are being disproportionately decreased. So, let's sum this up. As a felon, society has great expectations of how your life should be after you leave prison. We expect you to reintegrate back into society as an upstanding, employed citizen who can depend on yourself completely for your well-being. However, because you are a poor black felon, you are going to be worse off than wealthier felons, especially white ones. This is not based off the magnitude of your crime, but of your socioeconomic class and racial classification. So do tell us, how is this justifiable? Of course, many of these inequities are avoidable. For one, we should stop taking away business certificates from nonviolent felons. Perhaps an assessment for requalification would be appropriate for when they leave prison, but stripping them of their qualifications to work altogether is unnecessary. Secondly, they should not be banned from the federal welfare programs because that disproportionately targets lower socioeconomic classes. Finally, felons should be given the chance to earn back the right to vote, the most basic of citizens' rights. The negative stigma which surrounds felons will be harder to solve because that resides in the minds of individuals. However, if felons are treated less as hopeless second-class citizens and allowed to have much more of their rights back on release from prison, then they will have a much better chance of a successful reintegration into society. In turn, a successful reintegration into society will harbor more respect for felons, lessening the negative stigma surrounding them.